While I was at work, my dad changed the locks and texted, "Your sister needs the room more. Your stuff's in the garage." I was paying him $1,400 a month. I didn't respond. I drove straight to a lawyer instead. By Thursday morning, a sheriff knocked at their door and wiped the smirk off their faces. "My name is Renata. I'm 29 years old. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and I need to tell you about the Tuesday afternoon I came home from a 10-hour shift and found out I no longer had a home to come back to. Not because of anything dramatic. Because of a text message. I was still in my work scrubs, coffee stain on my sleeve, sitting in a parking lot after my shift when my phone buzzed. 4 words and a dash from my father. "Your sister needs the room more. Your stuff's in the garage." Dad. I had been paying him $1,400 a month for 14 months. Never late. Not once. We had a signed agreement and everything. I read that text about 8 times. And then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes something is so absurd that laughing is the only thing left to do. Then something went very quiet inside me. And I thought, no. Not this time. Let me explain who we're dealing with. My dad, Gerald, but everyone calls him Gary, is 61 years old and has operated his entire life on one philosophy. His house, his rules. That was the soundtrack of my childhood. The rules just happened to be a lot more flexible depending on which daughter he was applying them to. My sister Daphne is 22, the baby of the family, and she learned early that if she cried long enough, Dad would fix it. Usually at my expense. I had moved back home 2 years earlier after a bad breakup left me financially shaky. Not my proudest moment. Moving back in with Gary at 27 is nobody's dream, but I was practical about it. We wrote up a formal agreement. I paid rent every month and I saved. By that Tuesday I had nearly $11,000 put away. Daphne, meanwhile, had been living across town with her boyfriend Trevor. Until they broke up 3 weeks earlier. And somehow, in some conversation I was never included in, it was decided that my room was now her room. No warning. No heads up. Just a text. I was at work. Did I text back? I did not. I called my cousin Frederica. Freddie, 32 years old and the most clear-headed person I know. She picked up on the second ring. "Freddie." He changed the locks. "Don't touch your stuff. Don't go inside. Come here." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Google Ohio tenant rights on the way." That is exactly why she is my emergency contact. Because here is what Gary never once considered in his Tuesday morning decision-making. A person paying $1,400 a month under a signed agreement for 14 consecutive months is not a house guest. She is a legal tenant. And in Ohio, you cannot lock a tenant out of their home without a court order. It even has a name, unlawful lockout, and it carries real consequences. I got to Freddie's. We spread everything out on her kitchen table. Every receipt, every text, the signed agreement. And Freddie's neighbor's son Marcus, who was finishing law school, came over and looked through it all. He looked up slowly and said, "Renata, your dad is in real trouble." I didn't celebrate. But I slept that night, which honestly surprised me. I called Gary once on Wednesday afternoon. He answered fast, which told me he'd been waiting. "Renata, Daphne is going through a really hard time. You changed the locks on a paying tenant, Dad. You are not a tenant. You are my daughter. I'm your daughter who paid you $1,400 a month with a signed agreement. In Ohio, that makes me your legal tenant. Regardless of whose daughter I am." Silence. "I think you're overreacting," he said. "Do you think I was overreacting? Because I've asked myself that more than once." I said, "Okay," and I hung up. Then I called the attorney Freddie had already found. A woman named Patricia who had zero interest in Gary's feelings and a great deal of interest in 14 months of receipts and a signed document. By Wednesday evening the notice was filed. By Thursday morning, a sheriff's deputy was knocking on the front door of my childhood home. Gary answered in his bathrobe. Daphne was eating cereal at the kitchen table. I know this because Gary called me 17 minutes later. And he did not sound like himself. He sounded like a man who had just realized exactly what he'd done. What he said on that call, and what Daphne said when she finally reached out, and what my grandmother Eloise said when she found out. I'll get to all of it very soon. But right now I just want to say, if you've ever been treated like an afterthought by someone who was supposed to have your back, I know that parking lot feeling. I know what it's like to read a text that tells you exactly where you rank in your own family. What would you have done? Gone home and confronted him, or done what I did? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And I'm coming back with that Thursday phone call because trust me, you want to hear it. So Gary called me 17 minutes after the sheriff knocked on his door. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Not going to lie, I wanted those 2 extra seconds. "Renata." His voice was completely different from the day before. The confidence was gone. What was left sounded a lot like a man standing in his bathrobe who had just been handed legal paperwork by a uniformed officer. Hey Dad. There was a sheriff here. At the house. I know. You called the police on your own father? And there was. Not I'm sorry. Not I shouldn't have done that. Straight to making himself the victim. I had to actually press my lips together to keep from saying something I'd regret. I didn't call the police, I said calmly. I contacted an attorney because you illegally locked me out of my legal residence. The sheriff's visit is a result of that. Those are two different things. Silence. I think this has gotten way out of hand, he said. Does that sound familiar to anyone? The moment the person who caused the problem decides it's all just gotten out of hand, as if it arrived there on its own? I told him I'd be in touch through my attorney and hung up. Now, here's where it gets a little complicated, and a little awkward, because that same afternoon Daphne called me. I almost didn't answer. But I did because whatever my feelings about the situation, Daphne is still my little sister and I'm not built to ignore her completely. She was crying before she even finished saying my name. Renata, I didn't know he was going to do it like that, I swear. I just told him I needed somewhere to go and he said he'd handle it and I didn't ask him to change the locks, I didn't know. Here's my honest reaction, I believed her. Partially. Daphne didn't plan the lockout, that was all Gary. But she also didn't ask any questions. She didn't call me. She just let Dad handle it, and moved her stuff in without once thinking, hey, maybe I should mention this to my sister. That part one told her directly. Daph. You knew I was living there. You knew I was paying rent. You didn't think to give me one phone call. She got quiet, which was its own kind of answer. I wasn't cruel about it, but I wasn't soft about it either. I told her I loved her and that this wasn't really about her. It was about what Dad did. And then I told her I had to go. What I didn't tell her yet was what Patricia had laid out for me that morning. Because here's where things took a turn I genuinely did not expect. Patricia called me while I was still parked outside Freddie's building and walked me through my options. I could pursue the unlawful lockout, which would likely result in Gary being ordered to restore my access and potentially pay damages and legal fees. She said it plainly without drama. This was not a complicated case. The agreement was clear, the payments were documented, the lockout was textbook illegal. But she also asked me something I hadn't fully thought through yet. What outcome do you actually want, Renata? Do you want back in that house or do you want to use this as leverage to move on your own terms? I sat with that for a long moment. Did I actually want to go back? Back to Gary's house, back to Sunday dinners where I smiled through gritted teeth, back to being the daughter who paid rent and still somehow mattered less? Honestly, no. What I wanted was for him to understand what he had done. I wanted it to cost him something real. And I wanted to leave on my terms, not his. So Patricia and I came up with a plan. And part of that plan involved my grandmother Eloise. Now, Eloise is 74 years old, lives 40 minutes away in Westerville, and is one of those women who says very little but means every single word of it. She had always been quietly in my corner. When my mother passed away 7 years ago, it was Eloise who held things together. And it was Eloise who had told Gary more than once over the years, gently but clearly, that he wasn't treating me fairly. Freddie had already called her. Of course she had. I called Eloise that evening and before I could say anything she said, I already spoke to your father. What did he say? Not much. I didn't give him a lot of room to pause. He knows he was wrong, Renata. He won't say it yet but he knows. That meant more to me than almost anything else that week. Not because Eloise fixed it, she didn't. But because sometimes you just need one person who is supposed to love you to confirm that no, you are not crazy and yes, this was wrong. Freddie, meanwhile, had done something very Freddie. She had already started quietly looking at apartments for me. Sent me 3 listings without any commentary, just the links, which is how Freddie says I've got you. By the end of that Thursday, I had a legal process in motion. A grandmother who had put Gary on notice. A cousin already apartment hunting on my behalf and $11,000 in savings. Gary, as far as I knew, had a sheriff's notice, a bathrobe and a lot of thinking to do. Not bad for 48 hours. But here's what I haven't told you yet. What happened Friday when Gary showed up at Freddie's apartment unannounced. What he said when she opened the door. And what I said when I walked out of the bedroom and he saw my face. That conversation? That's the one that actually changed everything. Would you have let him in? Because I'm still not sure I made the right call. Friday afternoon. Freddie's apartment. There was a knock at the door. Freddie looked through the peephole, turned around and gave me a look that said everything without saying anything. She held up one finger, 1 second and mouthed 2 words. It's Gary. I was sitting at her kitchen table in sweatpants eating leftover pasta. Which is honestly how I would have preferred not to be dressed for this particular confrontation, but life doesn't really coordinate outfits with your dramatic moments. Freddie opened the door and Gary was standing there in a button-down shirt, actually dressed, which told me he'd thought about this, holding a brown paper bag. I brought pastries, he said. I want you to really sit with that for a moment. The man who had illegally locked his 29-year-old daughter out of her home, tossed her belongings in a garage, and sent a 4-word text as explanation, showed up with pastries. I almost respected the audacity. Freddie looked at the bag, looked at him, said, "Gary, that's not going to cover it," and stepped aside to let him in anyway. I didn't get up. I stayed right at that table with my pasta and let him come to me. Small thing maybe, but it mattered. He sat down across from me, put the pastry bag on the table, and for a long moment he just looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something genuinely uncomfortable that was working very hard not to become an apology. Then he said, "I panicked. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. I panicked." "You panicked," I repeated. "Daphne was in a bad way and I reacted. I should have called you first. Should have called me first. As opposed to, I don't know, not illegally evicting me at all." But Gary. Here's where the unexpected part comes in. I had prepared myself for anger. Mine or his. I had prepared for him to be defensive, to minimize, to do the thing he always did where he acknowledged the surface of a problem without ever really touching it. I had a whole internal speech ready. Calm, firm, documented. What I was not prepared for was for him to put his hands flat on the table, look me directly in the eye and say, "Your mother would be ashamed of me." I did not see that coming. I don't talk about my mom much because it still catches me sideways when I least expect it. She passed 7 years ago and Gary had not, in 7 years, once voluntarily brought her into a conversation about his own behavior. Not once. The room got very quiet. Even Freddie, who was pretending to do something in the kitchen, went still. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, I did not cry. But I felt something shift in my chest that was almost physical. "Yeah," I said. "She probably would be." He nodded slowly. Didn't try to walk it back. And here is the thing about Gary that I have always struggled to explain to people. He is not a cruel man. He is a careless one. There is a difference, and somehow that difference makes it both better and worse. Cruelty has intention behind it. Carelessness is just, you not mattering enough for someone to slow down and think. That has always been the harder pill. But I had not come this far, had not called Patricia, had not filed the notice, had not spent 2 nights at Freddy's, to get soft over pastries and one honest sentence. So I took a breath and I said, "Dad, I'm not moving back." He blinked. "I'm not asking you to. I know. I'm telling you. Whatever happens legally, I am not coming back to that house. I'm going to find my own place. And you are going to continue paying Patricia's fees, because that was a direct result of your decision. And we are going to figure out the remaining rent I'm owed in damages." He opened his mouth. Closed it. "That's fair," he said finally. Quietly. "Do you think I was too hard on him?" Because Freddie, when she weighed in later, said I was exactly as hard as the situation required. Not more. Not less. But here's the part one genuinely did not see coming. The part that made even Freddie put her coffee cup down. Gary reached into his shirt pocket and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a check. Not for the legal fees. Not a partial amount. It was a check for $3,000 with nothing written in the memo line. Just blank, like he couldn't figure out what to call it either. I looked at it. Looked at him. "That doesn't fix it," I said. "I know," he said. "It's not supposed to fix it. It's supposed to start." And honestly, I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely. Click the check. Not because it made things okay, but because that money was going straight toward a security deposit on an apartment. My apartment, and there was something deeply satisfying about Gary unknowingly funding my exit. Is that petty? Maybe a little. But I think I earned a little petty. What I didn't tell Gary that Friday, what was still quietly unfolding in the background, was that Eloise had made her own move. Without telling me. Without asking permission. I found out about it Sunday morning and nearly choked on my coffee. Because Eloise, 74 years old and mild-mannered as she appears, had called Daphne directly. Not Gary. Daphne. And that conversation apparently lasted 45 minutes and left Daphne in tears. What did Eloise say to her? I'll tell you exactly, word for word. Because Daphne told me the whole thing herself when she showed up at Freddie's door on Sunday with red eyes and a box of my things she'd retrieved from the garage. That conversation is something I think about a lot. Because it's the moment the whole thing actually started to turn. Hold tight, because Eloise, it turns out, had been waiting a very long time to say what she said. Sunday morning, Freddie's apartment. I was on my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. "Daphne, can I come over?" I showed Freddie the text. He shrugged. "Your call." I said yes. She showed up 40 minutes later with red eyes, my winter coat folded over one arm, and a box of my things she'd pulled from the garage herself. She set everything down carefully like she was handling something fragile, and then just stood there looking at me. Grandma called me, she said. I heard. Renata, she said things to me that she stopped. Pressed her lips together. I didn't realize. I knew Dad always made things easier for me, but I didn't understand what that meant for you. Not really. Here's my honest reaction. I believed her. And it annoyed me a little that I believed her because it would have been simpler not to. What exactly did Eloise say? I asked. Daphne sat down and told me the whole thing. Eloise had called her Saturday morning and in her particular way, quiet, steady, no raised voice, had laid out 45 minutes worth of truth. She told Daphne about patterns she had watched for years. The way Gary celebrated Daphne's smallest wins and barely acknowledged mine. The way problems in Daphne's life became the whole family's emergency while my struggles were expected to be handled privately. She told Daphne about the year after our mother died, when I was 22 and essentially running the house while Gary grieved, and Daphne, 14 at the time, was carefully shielded from all of it. She said I'd been handed a life raft, Daphne said, and you'd been handed a map and told to find your own water. I had to look at the ceiling for a second. That sounds like Eloise, I said. She also said, Daphne hesitated. She said if I was a good person I already knew what I needed to do. And if I didn't, that would tell me something too. 74 years old. Not a single wasted word. Daphne apologized. It was genuine, not polished, not rehearsed. Messy and a little awkward, which is how real apologies usually sound. She said she should have called me the second she and Trevor broke up. She should have talked to me before any decisions were made. She should have never let Dad handle it without asking what handling it actually meant. I accepted it. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because carrying anger at Daphne on top of everything else wasn't something I had energy for. What I told her was simple. If you need a place, talk to me next time. Directly. Not through Dad. She nodded. Then quietly, did you find an apartment? Freddie's been looking. There's one in Clintonville I'm seeing Tuesday. Her face did something complicated, relief and guilt arriving at exactly the same time. I didn't make it easier for her. But I didn't make it harder either. The Clintonville apartment, by the way, 2 bedrooms, good light, 3rd floor, $1,200 a month. I put the application in Tuesday afternoon. Patricia had confirmed by then that Gary would be responsible for her fees, and the $3,000 check had already cleared. Combined with my savings, I had more than enough for the deposit in first few months. I called Eloise that evening to tell her. She said, good. You should have had your own place a year ago. I laughed. You could have told me that a year ago. You wouldn't have listened, she said. Which was probably true. What I didn't expect, what genuinely caught me off guard, was the voicemail Gary left me Tuesday night. After I'd seen the apartment. After I'd submitted the application. After all of it. It was 3 minutes long. He clearly hadn't planned what he was going to say because he stumbled through most of it. But somewhere in the middle he said, I think I've spent a lot of years confusing taking care of Daphne with taking care of both of you. And I don't have a good excuse for that. Your mother was better at it than me, and when she left I defaulted to what was easy. And you were never the easy one, Renata. You were always the one I didn't have to worry about. And I think I let that become a reason to ignore you instead of a reason to be proud of you. That wasn't fair. It wasn't fair at all. I listened to it twice. Then I sat on Freddie's couch for a while without saying anything. Was it enough? No. 3 minutes on a voicemail doesn't undo years of being the daughter who mattered less. But was it real? Yeah. I think it was real. Freddie came in, took one look at my face and said, Gary? I nodded. She sat down next to me, didn't say anything, and handed me the rest of her chips. That's friendship. That's the whole thing right there. I hadn't responded to Gary's voicemail yet. I was still deciding what I wanted to say, or whether I wanted to say anything at all, because there was still one conversation left that I knew was coming. One that I'd been turning over in my mind since Thursday morning. A real one. Face to face. Just me and Gary, no attorneys, no Freddie in the kitchen, no pastries as a peace offering. That conversation happened the following Saturday. And it went in a direction I absolutely did not see coming. The following Saturday I drove to Gary's house for the first time since he'd changed the locks. I want to tell you that I felt powerful pulling into that driveway. That I had some cinematic sense of resolution. Honestly, I was just nervous. The kind of nervous that sits in your stomach and doesn't respond to logic. Daphne opened the door. She gave me a quick, slightly awkward hug and then disappeared into her room with the quiet tact of someone who understood this wasn't her moment. I appreciated that more than I told her. Gary was in the kitchen. He'd made coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff he usually defaulted to, and had set out 2 mugs like he'd been planning this part at least. He looked older than I remembered. Which was strange because I'd seen him 3 weeks ago. Grief and guilt apparently have a physical address, and they'd both moved into his face. We sat down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, I've been trying to figure out how to start this for a week. Just start somewhere, I said. It doesn't have to be perfect. He nodded, wrapped both hands around his mug. And then Gary, my 61-year-old father who had spent my entire life being absolutely certain about everything, said he wasn't sure he'd known how to be a father to me after my mother died. That she had been the one who understood me, who knew how to reach me. And when she was gone he'd leaned into Daphne because Daphne was louder about needing him and I was quieter. And he'd mistaken my quiet for independence when really it was just me learning not to ask. I had not planned to say what I said next. It came out before I could edit it. I stopped asking because the answer was always Daphne. He flinched. And I let him. You're right, he said. You're completely right. Do you know how long I'd waited to hear that? Not the apology, I mean the acknowledgement. The simple, clean, unqualified you're right. No buts. No qualifications. No pivot to his own pain. Just you're right. I exhaled something I think I'd been holding for years. We talked for almost 2 hours. Real talking, the uncomfortable, non-linear kind where people say things and then sit with them and then say something else. He asked questions about my life that he genuinely didn't know the answers to. My job, my friends, what I actually wanted for myself. Things a father should know about his 29-year-old daughter and didn't, because he'd never thought to ask. At one point he said, I think I owe Eloise an apology too. She's been trying to tell me this for years. She really has, I said. She's going to enjoy being right. She really is, I said. And we both laughed, a small, tired, real laugh. The kind that only happens when something has been genuinely hard. By the end of it nothing was magically fixed. I wasn't moving back. The apartment in Clintonville was mine. I'd gotten the call Thursday morning, approved, move-in date set. My life was already pointing in a new direction and I wasn't changing that regardless of how Saturday went. But I drove away from that house feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not forgiveness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something more like room. Like I'd been carrying a weight so long I'd forgotten it was there, and someone had finally helped me put it down. Not because they were noble. Because they were finally honest. I called Eloise from the car. How did it go? She asked. Better than I expected. She said, which from Eloise is basically a standing ovation. He said he owes you an apology. Then, he can bring it in person. I'll make tea. I moved into my apartment 3 weeks later. Freddie helped me carry boxes and complained about the stairs the entire time and refused to leave until every piece of furniture was exactly where I wanted it. Daphne showed up with a houseplant and a card that said your space, your rules, which made me smile more than she probably knew. Gary helped me move the heavy furniture. He didn't say much that day. Just worked and handed me things and at one point stood in the middle of my new living room and looked around like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. It's a good place, he said. Yeah, I said. It is. And it was. It really genuinely was. Is the story perfect? Well, Gary still defaults to Daphne sometimes. Old habits don't dissolve overnight. Daphne and I are still finding our footing as sisters rather than as two people orbiting the same man's approval. There are still dinners that get slightly awkward and conversations that require more patience than they should. But we're talking. Actually talking. And I have my own home, my $11,000 mostly intact. And the very satisfying knowledge that Patricia sent Gary a final invoice that he paid without a single complaint. That part one enjoyed. I won't pretend otherwise. If you've ever been the one in your family who was expected to be fine, the strong one, the quiet one, the one who pays rent and asks for nothing and somehow still ends up in the garage, I want you to know something. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to call a lawyer. You are allowed to stop being convenient for people who should be choosing you. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, the people who hurt you are capable of more than they've been giving. It doesn't excuse what they did. But it does mean the story doesn't have to end in the parking lot. Mine didn't. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. Drop something in the comments. And if something didn't land right, tell me that too. I can take it. If you made it all the way here, genuinely thank you. It means more than you know.